Today, we're launching into our series on plots and plotting, where we'll talk about the different elements of plot, how to write a plot well, and any other relevant things that I feel like talking about. I thought we would begin by talking about startings. Start by talking about beginnings. The first part of a plot is by far the most important. While a limp ending and a meandering middle won't do you any favors, a bad beginning is a surefire way to make sure the reader never reaches either the middle or the end of your story. The best endings are supported by what gets established in the beginning, and pulling a reader through the middle of a novel, which is notoriously difficult to write well, can be a much easier task if you have an interesting and engaging beginning. There's a lot that needs to happen in the beginning of a story. You need to introduce your world and characters, establish tone, stakes, motivations, and conflict, all while introducing all of these things to the reader for the first time in a way that doesn't overwhelm or bore them. There's a lot to do in the beginning of a novel, and sorting all of that out is no easy task. So to help you not forget anything, we're going to be talking about what you need to accomplish in the beginning of your story. These are the major items that you need to cover. It's by no means an exhaustive list, and for some stories you may not need to do all of these things, but we'll talk about that later. Also, I already have a video on beginnings if you want to check that out. That video is more focused on how to pace a beginning and deal with expository information, whereas today we're more focused on the plot items to cover in the beginning of a story. The first step in writing a beginning, and the first thing that a beginning generally accomplishes, is to establish the status quo, both for the characters and for the setting. As we'll talk about throughout this series, plots are really about change, and before you can get around to changing things, you need to first establish things. This is who the character was and what the world was like before the story started. This status quo sets up who the characters are and what their life would have been like if the plot hadn't ran into them. This does not mean that the characters need to be prosperous or even comfortable. Their status quo doesn't need to be something they enjoy, but it should be something that is familiar to them. The main conflict of the story might exist at the beginning of the story. Say your main character is locked away in a dungeon and needs to escape. Or it might not get introduced until the inciting incident, when, aliens appear and lock your character in a dungeon. Aliens can have dungeons. The one exception to this is if you're starting in media res, or potentially with a prologue. In both of those situations, you would be starting the story with the status quo already disrupted in some way, although not always with a prologue. Regardless, even if you're starting in media res, which I am pronouncing wrong, you are at some point going to establish what the status quo was before that thing happened to the character. Speaking of the character, you want to introduce the reader to the main viewpoint characters very early in the story. Ideally, chapter 1 should begin from the viewpoint of whoever the main character is going to be. You do not want to start with a character who is not the main character most of the time. Whoever the reader sees in chapter 1 is who they're going to assume is one of, if not the main characters for the story. You also want to avoid introducing a large cast all at once right at the beginning of the story, especially if they are separated in different settings and not interacting with or don't know the other characters. General advice here is to start in the beginning with one or two named characters and introduce other characters gradually. You can immediately throw the reader into a scene with a dozen named characters, but that's hard to do without overwhelming or confusing them. You want to make sure that the reader is locked in and comfortable with your main character before you start throwing a bunch of other characters at them. When introducing a character, it's important to establish their goals and motivations as quickly as possible. Even if the thing they want is not what they will ultimately be pursuing throughout the story, a character who wants something, even if it's just a cheese plate, will be much more interesting than one who doesn't. Although it helps if the thing that they want in the beginning is somehow tied to their overarching goals and motivations. We also don't need to know everything about a character's history or backstory right at the beginning, but again, we should know what they want. Even if they're a black box, don't even have their own memories, Jason Bourne type character, they should still want something, even if they don't remember. There's a lot of advice out there when it comes to introducing a character, and a lot of this advice also applies to beginnings. Don't start with the character waking up in the morning. Don't start with a physical description of the character. Don't introduce us to a character who isn't actually the main character. Eventually, after we've been introduced to the character, something is going to happen to them. Unless you're doing that weird Latin thing that I can't pronounce. After the status quo has been established and we've met the characters, some event needs to occur that sets the rest of the story into motion. Not to lose you with the technical jargon, but it should really mess things up for the character. This is generally referred to as the inciting incident, although different plot structures will call it by different names. The purpose of this event is to disrupt the status quo, create conflict for the main characters, and move the story into the next section. The inciting incident is quickly followed by a transition from the beginning of the story into the middle of the story. Another way to say the same thing is it's the beginning of the rising action. There is also a point near the inciting incident where the main character goes from being reactive to being proactive, where they make the decision to act on the conflict and seek out what it is they want. You could argue that that's actually the inciting incident, the moment where the character decides to become proactive, or you could argue that the inciting incident is the actual event that leads them to being proactive. Regardless, up until this point in the story, the reader has just been figuring out who the story is about and where it's taking place. The inciting incident is what establishes what the characters will be doing and why they are doing it. We don't need to know every detail of how things will play out, nor should we, but you need to understand the reader will have certain expectations, and it's important that those expectations are set properly. This is a point in the story where tone gets established, and also where a lot of the plot promises get made. These are the things that will hook the reader into the story and make them decide if they want to continue or not. While an interesting hook right at the beginning or being introduced to a really interesting character will help pull a reader into the beginning, it's the inciting incident and the expectations and promises that get made around it that will make them want to stick around for the rest of the story. Really then, the purpose of the beginning is to get the reader to that point, while also providing them all the background information that they need so that the inciting incident has sufficient impact. A good beginning will make the reader want to stick around long enough to see what is going to happen with the characters. It could be argued that the beginning part of a story is a plot unto itself. We're given very early expectations when the status quo and characters are introduced. This should create enough curiosity as things build up to the inciting incident. Then when the inciting incident happens, that's kind of like the climax of the beginning. We get some kind of resolution, the character decides to act, and then we're off to the rising action. Instead of where we are right now, because we're off to the end of this video. Well, did you expect the conclusion to be good? It's a video about beginnings. Next week, I think we'll dig in a little bit more into the inciting incident and the point where the character becomes proactive. I'm going to have to come up with a much zippier thing to call that. Anyway, until then, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. And subscribe, I never say that right. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.